You know what scared me most that morning? Nothing was making a sound. At 4:37 in the morning, I pushed open the milk room door with a steel coffee mug in my right hand and stopped before taking my second step. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 46 years old, and I have spent enough mornings inside a Wisconsin dairy barn to know that silence usually means something has stopped doing its job. The room smelled like chlorine sanitizer, fresh milk, damp concrete, and the coffee I had poured 5 minutes earlier. Outside, our Holsteins shifted against the gates while a ventilation fan hummed somewhere deeper in the barn. But the sound I had heard every morning for years was missing. The compressor on my $14,000 bulk milk cooler was dead quiet. I set my coffee on the counter and crossed the room. The stainless steel felt cool beneath my palm, but that did not reassure me. The milk was still cold. The problem was that I had no idea whether the power had been gone for 5 minutes or 50, or whether it would stay gone for another 6 hours. Refrigeration does not negotiate with a schedule. Neither does a milk pickup. I checked the temperature display, wrote the number on a yellow pad, then walked to the electrical panel. No obvious breaker had tripped. No burnt smell. No hot plastic. No motor struggling to restart. Everything looked normal except for the one thing that mattered. The cooler had no power. I called my electrician, Mark Delaney, and gave him the shortest explanation I could. Bulk cooler is down. Panel looks normal. Mark was awake enough to understand the urgency. Do not start resetting anything. I am on my way. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The August air was cool against my face. Dew darkened the gravel around my boots. Beyond the eastern field, the porch lights of Oak Ridge Estates glowed between rows of young maple trees. Their houses looked peaceful from my side of the fence. My beam moved across the service route toward the gray electrical enclosure near the property boundary, and that was when I noticed something I had not seen the evening before. Fresh marks cut through the weathered finish around the hardware. Bright metal showed beneath the gray surface. I moved closer but kept my hands off it. 3 days earlier, Oak Ridge Homeowners Association President Patricia Caldwell had stood in this exact spot and told me she would find out who controlled that equipment. I had told her plainly that it served my farm and that nobody from her association had permission to touch it. At the time, I thought that ended the conversation. My phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen lit my hand in the darkness. New email. Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The subject line contained 4 words, electrical correction work completed. I read them once. Then again. Behind me, hundreds of gallons of milk sat inside a cooler whose compressor was still silent. Ahead of me, fresh tool marks reflected my flashlight. I looked toward those perfect houses beyond the fence and felt the first piece of the morning click into place. Patricia thought she had corrected a neighborhood problem before sunrise. She had no idea that the decision behind that email was about to turn into a $42,000 mistake. While I waited for Mark, I stood beside that gray enclosure and remembered when the land beyond it had been nothing but soybeans. Mercer Dairy Farm had been here since 1959, when my grandfather bought 70 acres with a small red barn, 20 cows, and more optimism than money. My father expanded it through the 1980s and 1990s, and by the time I took over, we were working 118 acres and milking 92 Holsteins. My life had always been measured by ordinary things: feed deliveries, weather reports, veterinary visits, milk pickups, equipment maintenance, and mornings that started while most kitchen lights in town were still dark. Then, for years earlier, the soybean field east of US was sold to a developer. Survey stakes appeared first, then excavators, then paved streets, decorative stone walls, young maple trees, and 63 houses arranged around curved roads with names like Heritage Glen Drive and Oak Meadow Court. They called the development Oak Ridge Estates. At first, the new neighbors seemed happy to live. Beside us, parents brought children to the fence to watch calves. People waved when I passed on the tractor. One homeowner told me the farm made the neighborhood feel authentic. I remember that word because it lasted about 6 months. Authentic became inconvenient the first time a milk tanker rolled down my gravel lane before 5 in the morning. Then came a complaint about tractor headlights during harvest. Another about the backup alarm on my skid steer. Another about manure spreading after somebody planned an outdoor birthday party. I answered politely whenever someone contacted me directly. A working dairy farm has sounds, smells, trucks, machinery, and animals. None of that had suddenly appeared because Oak Ridge built houses next door. Patricia Caldwell entered the picture during the development's second year. She was 54, always dressed as if a board meeting might begin without warning, with a neat blonde bob, tailored jackets, and a leather folder tucked under one arm. The first time she came to my farm, she parked her spotless white sport utility vehicle at the edge of the gravel and introduced herself as president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. She handed me a typed list of concerns: exterior lighting, early commercial traffic, visible equipment, agricultural odors. I read it, then looked at her. Patricia, Mercer Dairy is not part of Oak Ridge. She gave me a patient smile that somehow felt less friendly than an argument. Your activities still affect our residents. That does not put my farm under your association. She glanced toward the barn instead of answering. After that, the letters started arriving. Some were complaints. Some were requests. Eventually, they became notices written in language that sounded official without explaining what authority Oak Ridge actually had over me. I saved every one. My father had kept property records in a blue 3-ring binder for decades, and I added Patricia's correspondence to it. I did not know then how valuable that habit would become. The complaints kept changing, but the pattern stayed the same. When noise went nowhere, Patricia tried lighting. When lighting went nowhere, she tried appearance. Then one afternoon, she noticed the gray electrical enclosure near our eastern boundary. I saw her standing beside the walking trail, staring at it through the fence. She took out her phone, photographed it, and wrote something in her folder. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived from Oak Ridge. For the first time, Patricia was no longer complaining about how my farm looked or sounded. She was claiming that part of its electrical infrastructure had become a community safety concern. The certified letter used the phrase potential electrical hazard 3 times, but it never identified an actual hazard. Patricia claimed the gray enclosure was too close to an Oak Ridge walking trail and might affect what she called the community utility corridor. That phrase caught my attention because no community utility corridor crossed my property. I pulled the parcel map from my blue binder, spread it across my kitchen table, and checked the eastern boundary again. The enclosure sat on my land, roughly 60 feet from the nearest Oak Ridge house, and well outside their common property. The next afternoon, I emailed Patricia a simple response. Mercer Dairy Farm was not governed by Oak Ridge covenants. The equipment served private agricultural operations, and the association had no permission to enter my property or authorize work on it. I attached the parcel map. Her reply came 11 minutes later. We disagree with your interpretation. I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. A property line was not an opinion, but Patricia seemed to believe enough official language could turn one into a negotiation. 2 days later, her white sport utility vehicle appeared at the edge of my lane. I was replacing a worn hose near the barn when I saw her walking toward the eastern fence with the leather folder under her arm. I met her beside the gray enclosure before she could go any farther. I received your email, she said. Then you know where I stand. She opened the folder and showed me a photograph of the enclosure taken from the Oak Ridge Trail. Someone had circled it in red ink. Beneath the photograph were the words non-conforming electrical infrastructure. Non-conforming to what? I asked. Our community standards. Your standards do not apply to my farm. Her expression tightened. This is no longer about appearance. It is about safety. I looked at the enclosure, then back at her. Has the utility declared it unsafe? She did not answer. Has a county inspector? Again, nothing. Instead, she stepped closer to the fence and studied the equipment as if looking at it long enough might create jurisdiction. Everything affecting Oak Ridge eventually becomes our responsibility. I could smell freshly cut grass drifting from the subdivision side and diesel from my tractor behind me. 2 different worlds separated by a fence and a line on a county map. Patricia, listen carefully. Do not enter my property, and do not authorize anyone to work on equipment serving this farm. She gave me the same patient smile she had worn during our first meeting. Then we will find out who controls it. That evening, I went into my office and sent another email documenting the conversation. I wrote that Oak Ridge had no authorization to modify, disconnect, relocate, or otherwise interfere with electrical equipment on Mercer Dairy property. I copied the message to my personal account, printed it, wrote the date and time across the top, and placed it in the blue binder. Thursday, 6:14 in the evening. For the next 2 days, nothing happened. On Sunday afternoon, I noticed a contractor truck parked inside Oak Ridge near the walking trail. Two men photographed the area around the enclosure from the subdivision side. When I walked toward them, they climbed back into the truck and drove away. The logo on the door read Lakeshore Electrical Services. I wrote that down too. Less than 48 hours later, at 4:37 in the morning, my milk cooler went silent. At 4:58 that morning, Mark Delaney's service truck rolled onto my gravel lane, headlights sweeping across the barn before he parked beside the milk room. He had been our electrician for 12 years, long enough to know that when I called before sunrise, I was not calling about a flickering light. I showed him the cooler first, then the panel, then walked him outside to the gray enclosure. Mark aimed his flashlight across the hardware and stopped when the beam reached the fresh marks I had noticed earlier. He did not touch anything. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started taking photographs. "Was anyone authorized to work here?" he asked. "Not by me." I showed him the Oak Ridge email. He read the subject line, then looked toward the subdivision. "Let me document this before we change anything." That was the moment I stopped thinking of the outage as a failed piece of equipment. Mark photographed the enclosure, identification labels, conduit, service route, and every visible sign of recent work. Then he called the utility and requested verification of any scheduled service activity associated with my address. While he waited, I checked the milk temperature again and wrote it down. Still cold. Still safe. But every quiet minute reminded me that temporary stability was not the same as refrigeration. At 5:21, a utility dispatcher confirmed there had been no scheduled outage and no utility crew assigned to disconnect service to my farm. She also found a contractor inquiry from the previous afternoon asking about electrical equipment near the Oak Ridge boundary, but no authorization had been issued to interrupt my agricultural load. Mark put the call on speaker while I wrote the representative's name and time in my notebook. Then headlights appeared at the end of the lane. I recognized the white sport utility vehicle before it reached us. Patricia parked near the fence and stepped out wearing a cream jacket over dark slacks, looking far more prepared for a board meeting than a dairy farm before sunrise. She glanced at Mark's truck, then at the open electrical enclosure. "Good morning, Daniel," she said. "I assume you received the association notice." "I received it." "Then you understand why the correction was necessary." Mark looked at me, but stayed silent. I asked, "What exactly did Oak Ridge authorize?" Patricia shifted the leather folder under her arm. "We authorized Lakeshore Electrical Services to correct the unsafe connection affecting our community boundary." "Did you authorize work on this equipment?" "Yes." Her answer came immediately. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Behind me, the cooler remained silent. I could hear cows moving inside the barn and gravel clicking beneath Mark's boots. I took out my phone. "Can you send me that in writing?" Patricia gave me a look that suggested she thought the request was pointless. "Certainly." She typed for several seconds. My phone vibrated. I opened the new email while she stood 10 feet away. Oak Ridge Estates authorized Lakeshore Electrical Services to perform the electrical correction adjacent to association property. The work was completed under my direction as association president. Patricia Caldwell. I saved the message, forwarded it to my personal account, and looked back at her. She had just handed me something far more valuable than an argument. She had handed me a time-stamped admission. Patricia was still standing beside her white sport utility vehicle when Mark asked the question she clearly had not expected. Who at Lakeshore actually performed the electrical work? She looked at him. "They are licensed professionals." That was not my question. Her expression tightened. "You will have to contact them." Mark nodded once and returned to his truck. Patricia turned to me and said, "Daniel, whatever repairs your farm requires are your responsibility." I looked at the email she had sent less than 2 minutes earlier. "We will see." She left at 5:34, tires crunching softly over the gravel, and I watched her taillights disappear toward Oak Ridge. Then the morning became about milk instead of arguments. I checked the temperature again. It was still within the safe range, but the number had moved upward. Mark called another electrician from his company and requested temporary power equipment while I contacted our milk hauler. I explained that refrigeration had been interrupted and that I was documenting temperatures until power could be restored. The dispatcher told me to keep recording everything and update them before pickup. By 6:10, Mark's second truck arrived. Tool cases opened across the concrete. Heavy cable, temporary distribution equipment, meters, and safety gear came out in an orderly sequence. Nobody rushed blindly. That mattered. The fastest repair in the world was useless if it created another problem. At 6:32, a utility representative named Rachel Monroe arrived in a blue service truck. She checked the service identification, reviewed the utility records, and compared them with Mark's photographs. I handed her Patricia's email. Rachel read it twice. Is Mercer Dairy part of Oak Ridge Estates? No. Did you authorize their contractor to modify equipment serving this farm? No. She entered something into her tablet. Then she walked the service route with Mark. By 7:15, they had a temporary restoration plan that kept everyone on the right side of the rules. The county electrical inspector was contacted, the affected equipment remained documented, and Mark's crew began setting up temporary power for the critical refrigeration load. At 8:03, I stood inside the milk room while Mark made the final checks. There was a click from the temporary equipment. A second of silence followed. Then the compressor started. The deep mechanical hum filled the room again, steady and familiar. I felt the vibration through the concrete before I realized I was smiling. The milk had remained cold enough throughout the outage, and the immediate crisis was over. I picked up the steel coffee mug I had abandoned hours earlier. The coffee was completely cold. I did not care. Then Mark walked back into the room, carrying his meter. He was not smiling. Temporary power buys us time, he said. But I cannot put the permanent service back the way it was. Why not? He pointed toward the eastern side of the farm. Because Lakeshore did more than open a disconnect. They altered part of the service arrangement. The county wants the affected section restored under permit and inspected before permanent reconnection. I looked toward the cooler, listening to the compressor that had just come back to life. How big a job? Mark glanced at his notes. I need to trace everything first. The emergency had stopped getting worse. The bill had only started. By 9:20 that morning, Mark had traced enough of the affected service to explain why there was no cheap way back. He spread a hand-drawn diagram across the hood of his truck while Rachel stood beside him with the utility records open on her tablet. Lakeshore had not simply switched something off. Their work had changed part of the service arrangement near the eastern boundary, and the county would not approve a permanent reconnection until the affected section was restored under permit and inspected. We can keep the cooler on temporary power, Mark said, but the permanent repair has to be done right. That was all I needed to hear. I was not interested in shortcuts. I wanted the farm operating safely, and I wanted every dollar tied to something a licensed professional could explain later. Mark started building the estimate. First came replacement service equipment and a new disconnect, then conduit and conductors for the affected run. The route required excavation along the gravel lane, but the trench could not block access for the milk tanker, so the excavation crew had to work in stages. Temporary power had to remain available while the permanent system was rebuilt. The utility needed to coordinate the final service work. The county inspector needed access before anything was covered. Then the gravel and disturbed ground had to be restored. By noon, 3 trucks were parked near the milk room, and orange marking paint traced the proposed route across the edge of the lane. The farm kept moving around them. Cows still had to be fed. The tanker still had to get through. Water still had to run. Every hour of emergency scheduling added labor that would never have existed if nobody had touched the service in the first place. Mark brought me the first written estimate shortly after lunch. $18,900. I read it twice. That is the starting number? That is what we know right now. By the next morning, excavation and temporary service pushed the estimate above $26,000. Then the utility identified additional coordination and equipment requirements for the permanent reconnection. The county inspection added another scheduled step. Gravel restoration and emergency labor moved the number again. $33,400. I kept every revised estimate in the blue binder behind Patricia's emails. 2 days later, Mark walked into my office with the latest worksheet and placed it beside my coffee. This should be the full emergency restoration estimate. I looked at the total, $42,000. For several seconds, all I heard was the wall clock and the distant compressor humming in the milk room. Nobody had added decorative upgrades. Nobody had replaced equipment just because it was old. The number came from restoring the affected service safely, keeping critical refrigeration operating, coordinating licensed electrical work, excavation, utility requirements, inspection, and putting the site back together afterward. My phone buzzed on the desk. Another email from Patricia. Oak Ridge Estates will not accept responsibility for expenses associated with your private agricultural electrical system. I printed it and placed it directly behind the email where she had written that the work was completed under her direction. Then I called attorney Rebecca Shaw. Rebecca, I think I finally have everything. She asked, everything for what? I looked at the two emails sitting side by side. For showing them exactly how a $42,000 problem started. Rebecca Shaw arrived at the farm the next afternoon carrying a laptop, a yellow legal pad, and the kind of patience that made people regret putting careless things in writing. She had handled a property easement for my father years earlier, so she already knew Mercer Dairy existed long before Oak Ridge. We sat at the old desk in my office while the compressor hummed through the wall behind us. I handed her the blue binder. She started at the beginning instead of jumping to the $42,000 estimate. Parcel map. Oak Ridge complaints. Patricia's certified safety letter. My written warning from Thursday at 6:14 in the evening. The utility record showing no authorized outage. Mark's photographs. Rachel's notes. Lakeshore's involvement. Then Patricia's email confirming the work had been completed under her direction. Rebecca stopped there. Did you give Oak Ridge permission at any point? No. Did you give Lakeshore permission? No. She turned another page and found Patricia's later refusal to accept responsibility. Rebecca placed the two emails side by side. She authorized the work in the first one and denies the consequences in the second. That is how I read it. Rebecca nodded. Now we get the contractor record. She contacted Lakeshore Electrical Services that afternoon with a preservation request and asked for the work order, authorization, scope, photographs, and communications connected to the job. Their operations manager responded the following morning. The work order arrived as a scanned document. Oak Ridge Estates appeared as the customer. Patricia Caldwell appeared as the association representative who approved the requested correction. Attached notes referenced an electrical condition near the community boundary and instructions supplied by the association. I printed the pages and slid them behind Patricia's email. The binder was becoming a timeline nobody could talk around. Over the next several days, the permanent work continued. Mark's crew installed the replacement equipment and completed the affected run while the utility and county inspector handled their portions of the process. The final invoices arrived one by one. Electrical labor and materials, temporary power, excavation, utility coordination, inspection-related work, gravel restoration. When Mark brought the last invoice into my office, the estimate held $42,000. Rebecca sent Oak Ridge a formal demand with copies of the supporting records and requested that the association preserve all communications involving Patricia and Lakeshore. Oak Ridge responded 3 business days later through counsel. The letter claimed Patricia had never intended to interrupt farm operations and disputed whether the association should be responsible for the entire restoration. Rebecca read that sentence aloud, then looked at me. Intent is not the same thing as authorization. 2 days later, another response arrived. This time Patricia claimed she had approved only a safety review, not work that would interrupt my refrigeration equipment. I opened the binder to her time-stamped email. The work was completed under my direction as Association President. Rebecca read it again and smiled slightly. Keep this page exactly where it is. That Thursday was Oak Ridge's monthly board meeting. For months, Patricia had used notices, official language, and association letterhead to make her authority look larger than it was. I carried the blue binder into the clubhouse, knowing something she did not seem to understand yet. Paperwork works both ways. The Oak Ridge clubhouse smelled like coffee, furniture polish, and fresh printer paper when Rebecca and I walked in at 6:52 that Thursday evening. About 30 homeowners had already taken seats along the back wall, and Patricia sat at the center of the board table with 3 neat folders stacked in front of her. She wore a cream jacket and the same controlled expression I had seen beside my electrical service. I placed the blue binder on the table and sat beside Rebecca. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody needed to. 20 minutes into the meeting, Patricia introduced my dispute as an unresolved matter involving agricultural electrical infrastructure adjacent to association property. Then she told the board Oak Ridge had requested only a safety correction and had never authorized anyone to interrupt my farm operations. Rebecca wrote something on her legal pad and slid it toward me. Let her finish. Patricia continued. She said the $42,000 restoration was my decision. that much of the work involved private equipment, and that Oak Ridge residents should not be responsible for improvements to a dairy farm they did not own. When she stopped, Board Treasurer Thomas Reed looked toward me. "Mr. Mercer, do you have documentation?" I put both hands on the blue binder and pushed it toward Rebecca. She opened the first tab. The county parcel map established the property boundary. The second showed my written warning telling Patricia that Oak Ridge had no authorization to enter my land or modify equipment serving the farm. The third contained the utility record showing no authorized outage. The fourth held Mark's photographs and the documentation from the morning the cooler lost power. Then Rebecca reached the Lakeshore work order. "Oak Ridge Estates is listed as the customer," she said. "Patricia Caldwell is identified as the association representative connected to the requested work." Patricia leaned toward the microphone. "That does not mean I authorized an interruption." Rebecca did not argue. She simply turned one page. My email printout lay beneath a clear sleeve. The work was completed under my direction as association president. The room became so quiet I could hear the ventilation system above us. Thomas asked Patricia when she sent it. "That morning," I said, while she was standing on my farm. Rebecca placed Patricia's later denial beside it. Then came the inspection documentation, temporary power records, permanent restoration invoices, excavation charges, utility coordination, and gravel restoration. The final total sat at the bottom of the last invoice, $42,000. One board member asked whether the board had voted to authorize work on Mercer Dairy property. The secretary checked the meeting records. No vote. Thomas asked whether any utility representative or county inspector had declared my service an emergency hazard before Lakeshore was contacted. No record of that existed either. Patricia looked down at her folders. "I acted to protect the community." Rebecca answered calmly. "The question is not what you believed you were protecting. The question is what authority the association had to direct work on property it did not control." Thomas removed his glasses and looked around the table. The board voted to remove Patricia from handling the dispute and refer the matter to the association's counsel and insurer for resolution. As Rebecca closed the binder, I remembered Patricia standing beside that gray enclosure telling me we would find out who controlled it. That night, in front of her own board, the paperwork finally answered her. 4 weeks later, I walked into the milk room at 4:37 in the morning with a fresh cup of coffee in my hand and stopped in the same place where I had stopped that first morning. The chlorine sanitizer smelled the same. The concrete beneath my boots was still cool. Outside, 92 Holsteins shifted behind the gates while the first pale strip of sunrise appeared beyond the Wisconsin fields. But this time, the room was not silent. The compressor hummed steadily beside me. I put my palm against the stainless steel and felt the vibration travel through the metal. The temperature display was exactly where it belonged. Mark's permanent electrical work had passed final county inspection. The utility had completed its portion of the service restoration, and the temporary equipment was gone. The trench beside the gravel lane had been filled and compacted. Fresh gravel covered the disturbed section so neatly that the milk tanker rolled across it without slowing down. The final documented restoration cost remained $42,000. After the board meeting, Oak Ridge's attorney and insurer spent the next several weeks reviewing the same records Rebecca had placed on that table. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. There did not need to be one. The association ultimately agreed to resolve the documented restoration costs, and the written settlement also confirmed something I had been saying from the beginning. Mercer Dairy Farm was outside Oak Ridge covenants, and the association had no authority to enter my property or direct work on my private agricultural electrical infrastructure. I cared about that paragraph almost as much as the money. Rebecca gave me a clean copy, and I framed it on the office wall above the filing cabinet my father had used for years. Patricia resigned as association president shortly afterward. Thomas Reed became interim president, and the first time he came to speak with me, he parked near the road and waited outside the fence until I invited him onto the property. It was a small thing, but I noticed it. The complaints stopped after that. No more letters about tractor lights. No more warnings about tanker trucks before sunrise. No more photographs of farm equipment circled in red. Oak Ridge was still there beyond my eastern field, with its trimmed lawns, curved streets, and young maple trees. My farm was still here too, with cows, diesel, gravel, early mornings, and work that had been happening decades before the first foundation was poured next door. I kept the blue binder. It had become too thick for its original shelf, so I moved it into the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside were the parcel map, Patricia's notices, my warning, Mark's photographs, Rachel's utility records, Lakeshore's work order, inspection documents, invoices, and the email Patricia probably wished she had never sent. She had spent months using paperwork to make her authority appear larger than it was. In the end, paperwork showed exactly where that authority stopped. At 5:02, the milk tanker turned onto my lane. Its headlights moved across the barn wall while gravel crackled beneath its tires. I took another sip of coffee and listened to the cooler running behind me. Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. Justice never made much noise around my farm. That morning, it sounded exactly like a compressor doing its job. Thank you for watching this story. If Daniel Mercer's patience, discipline, and determination to let the evidence speak for itself inspired you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends who enjoy compelling legal dramas and stories where facts overcome abuse of authority, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable HOA conflicts, property rights battles, and real-life justice stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story about crossed boundaries, ignored warnings, and ordinary people who quietly protect what generations before them worked so hard to build. Your support helps us continue bringing these remarkable stories to life, and we cannot wait to share the next one with you. That if you were in Daniel Mercer's position, would you have confronted the HOA immediately, or would you have stayed calm, documented every detail, and let their own emails and paperwork prove who was responsible? Tell us your choice in the comments and explain why.